Thanks for watching this C# support video. In this Fibonacci sequence challenge, we're going to focus on iteration, a for loop, and also using a procedure, the difference between a procedure and a function. So let's take a look. A Fibonacci sequence is where you add the previous two numbers together, and we need to make a procedure that displays the first n numbers. So a procedure is a named section of code that does not return a value. So we know that this section of code does not return a value because it returns void, it returns nothing. The name of the procedure is called Fibonacci sequence. It has one parameter, that's the input variable, called n. So if that is 1, it should just display one value. If it's 5, it should display 5 values. And that number includes the first two values in the sequence, which are 0 and 1. So just to see, these are the first two values in the sequence. The next value will be the sum of these added together. So 0 plus 1 is 1. And then we add the previous two values together for the next one, which is 2. And then we've got 1 plus 2 is 3, etc., etc., etc. So that's what we're aiming to do here. How do we do this? Well, we don't return a value because that would make it a function. We want to display a value. So I'm going to make some assumptions which probably aren't all that wise, but it's okay in this instance. I'm just going to display the first two values here because we're told the first two values are always going to be 0 and 1 in the Fibonacci sequence. And then we ought to store these. So let's create a variable for them. So previous value is going to be 1, and we can display that here instead. Zoom in a little bit. And then I don't know what to call it really. Previous but 1. But yeah, let's go for previous but 1. Or value before previous, I suppose might be better. Value before previous. And that's going to be a 0. And then Control Shift space to select a whole word. Control Shift and arrow key. We can paste that in there. Nice. So now we want some iteration, some kind of repetition. So let's use a counter. Say I starts at 0 and is less than the value of the parameter that we receive as an input. Increases by 1 each time until it's no longer less than n. However, we don't want to have this loop repeating 30 times if we want 30 values, or 50 times if we want 50 values, because we've already displayed the first two. So let's put -2 in here because that will compensate for the fact that we know the first two values are outside our loop. They're always going to be 0 and 1. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to update the value before the previous with the previous value. Before we can do that, we need to calculate the next value. So let's see, next value, that's the sum, which is going to be the value before the previous plus the previous value. This is where I wish I was in Visual Studio and I could do Control Space and just autocomplete. So once I've worked out the sum, I can then update the value before the previous to be set to previous value, and the previous, oops, if I can spell properly, previous value is going to be the next value. Oops. And then I want to display the previous value again, which has been updated to be the next value in our sequence. I hope that this will work, but I'm not feeling particularly confident. Let's see. Excellent. So things to watch here are that you understand the syntax of a for loop. That's what happens at the beginning of the for loop. We're making a variable, setting it to 0. What happens to test to see if your for loop needs to repeat each time? So is our counter less than the number of values we want in our sequence -2, because we've already displayed 2? And what happens to increase your counter or change your counter, because it doesn't always increase after each time it loops?